Welcome all to a very special late night live on Saturday night, wherever you're catching this, whether you're catching it tonight, whether you're catching it on Sunday morning. Please make sure to hit like, subscribe. This is going to be meaty. It's going to be substantial. It's going to be deep. And I promise if you bear with me, you're probably going to feel a little bit more optimistic about the Toronto Raptors than you currently feel right now. And I'll back it up. I promise. So, first and foremost, there's a sample size bias. Those who have, tuned into a lot of these lives, you know that I have a degree in stats. And one thing that I often find myself questioning is how big is the sample? How substantial is it relative to what? So this is the sample in question. Now, this is cleaning the glass, and you can see pretty much how this lineup fared analytically. Okay. And we're going to just scroll this across. Now, the one that you're going to want to look at is right there, second from the bottom. That is the lineup of Gary Trent, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, Scottie Barnes, and Jakob Poeltl. This is the lineup in question that was 6th percentile offensively, 1st percentile in terms of effective field goal percentage at 43.4%. It's not good. Okay, this lineup is not good at all. And if you just take into context that lineup, yes, you are extremely likely to feel very bearish about this season. But I want to point to another lineup. And this is, let's call it the second lineup. And you'll notice that this lineup is not in the 6th percentile, rather it is in the 90th percentile. And it features almost exactly the same players. It is a slightly larger sample size. Instead of 129 possessions, it's 140 possessions. And the only swap there is Christian Koloko for Jakob Poeltl. Now, if I didn't have a stats degree and if I was an absolute idiot, I might assume that Christian Koloko is a drastically better player than Jakob Poeltl, which is not true at all. He is a significantly worse player, even though I am very high on him, offensively especially. So why then was the offense so goddamn great with him? So how do you explain this other than small sample size? Honestly, I think it comes down to something kind of simple, which is that lineup that you saw of Jakob Poeltl, Gary Trent Jr., OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, Scottie Barnes, that was not a lineup that went through training camp together. It is not a lineup that had any formal understanding of how to play together. What you're seeing, 129 possessions, is basically the training wheels. The expectation, of course, is that as really smart players play together, they become more accustomed to playing together and they become better at playing together. That lineup wasn't really afforded that. 129 possessions is a ridiculously small sample size. How do I know this? Well, it amounts to just a little bit more than a game in terms of actual value. And you have to consider strength of opponent. You have to consider that the cutoff for this entire data set was 100 possessions. It barely made the cut. Nonlinear growth. You are talking about a lot of players who are incredibly young. Every single player in that starting lineup is under 30 years old. With the exception of Pascal Siakam and probably Jakob Poeltl, I would expect considerable growth from all of those players, especially Scottie Barnes. I don't think that any of them had great years last year by their standards or by anyone's standards, not by expectation standards. So how then are we expected to judge what that lineup will look like with the expectation that those players now know that that's what the lineup will look like? Does the development curve not swing more towards, hey, I know I'm going to be running pick and roll a lot this year as a ball handler. I need to tighten my handle a little bit more. Players often will have a meeting with management at the end of the season, at the conclusion of the previous season, and they will sort of ask, what is it that you need me to work on this year, and what is going to be my role? I think these 5 players have very clear roles on offense. There is no confusion about who is doing what in this lineup. It is very clear to me who the first, second, third option are in this lineup. It's very clear to me who the fourth option is. It's very clear to me who the significant screener is. It's very significant to me it's very obvious to me who the starters are. So this, I think, will help in terms of growth, clarification of roles. Okay. So I just want to say that anyone saying that they know exactly what Scottie's going to be next year or what Gary's going to be next year, I'm telling you, man, the history of the NBA is littered with guys who've taken unprecedented, unforeseen, very unpredictable jumps prior to the age of 25. And you don't know when players are this driven, this talented, and inherently this committed to their work in the off season. When things click, they click. And sometimes it doesn't exactly feel like it was something that you could have seen coming. Kawhi Leonard, after his first 2 years in San Antonio, not exactly a person you would have pegged to be a future MVP candidate or a top 5 player. I'm sorry. That trajectory was not there. Nikola Jokic as a draft prospect was not pegged to be an MVP. You know, I can think of one person who was on record saying that he would be an MVP, and that's Mike Miller, and maybe his own family. Now, it is clear to me that Scottie is not a great shooter, as is currently the projection. He's not a great shooter. He did, however, shoot 77% from the line, which is up from 62% as a freshman at Florida State. So I do see that he is not a non-shooter. You know, when we think about non-shooters, we think about Ben Simmons, Draymond Green. People like this traditionally struggle in all aspects of shooting, right? I've never thought, I don't think I can recall a single player who is a complete non-shooter who shot 77% from the line. It's really rare. I'm sure it's happened, but it's exceedingly rare. So I am very encouraged that Scottie will be a, let's say, slightly below average 3-point shooter, and that Pascal Siakam could potentially become an average 3-point shooter. But what do you do with Jakob Poeltl, right? This is a significant problem because when he is the roll man in a pick and roll, there is no threat to pop. He's always going to do the same thing, and if he doesn't do the thing that he's supposed to do, which is run to the paint and be a rim roller, well, then the defense can just double up on whoever's handling the basketball. The issue that people who think that they are very smart have brought up is that, well, Fred can shoot. Having him as a pick and roll ball handler still creates more separation and more confusion, more scramble for the defense. I'll address this in a couple of minutes, but I do want to say that this is not a good argument. And I also want to say that if Scottie gets a step on his defender, and I do believe that Jakob Poeltl has set some very interesting screens for Scottie, and he's even talked about it at length, that there's a difference between how he sets screens for Scottie and how he set screens for Fred. And I believe that as these two grow accustomed to each other, that the solid screens that both of these guys set for an offense is a really overwhelming positive. The second thing that I want to address is this notion of Jakob Poeltl being not a threat to score outside the paint. So there's this notion that if Jakob pops, then the opposing big will drop, therefore creating a second defender for any person wanting to go into the paint. I do think, however, that what Jakob presents with that extra space and with his processing speed and power is an ability to read the floor very well from that position. He has also shown, not in large sample size, an ability to attack closeouts or even attack a standstill defender on his way back. He can take 2-3 dribbles, get in the paint. At the very least, this is a player who can score from 12 feet. Okay. This is not quite Draymond, not quite a dunk only big. He has a little bit of a package around the paint. And I think that both he and Scottie can aggressively attack the space that is being created by the drop big. Now, Scottie didn't do that a lot last year, and that could have been health. It could have been his own lack of assertiveness. But there isn't a lot that you can do when a player that big and that skilled with long strides is coming at you other than to foul them, especially when both of these guys are really good, in my opinion, at least, at swinging that sort of drive into a post up, right? You'll often notice that Scottie will attack 2 dribbles, go in right into the post up. At that point that he gets the post up, depending on who is guarding him or who is guarding Jakob Poeltl, chances are one of these players has a favorable matchup. If they do not have a favorable matchup, then someone else has a favorable matchup. Because once these 2 players are closer to the paint, you have 2 shooters and you have Pascal Siakam probably spotting up above the break. I think this can work. How this can work specifically is the Playmaker Advantage. It's what I consider the value of playmaking. There are a lot of players that I would consider bad playmakers or non-playmakers. I think the Raptors have 3 very decent playmakers in Pascal, Jakob, and OG. And I think they have a very gifted playmaker in Scottie. What this means, in my humble estimate, is that there is this notion that 0.5 or 0.5 basketball cannot work without a paint finishing, penetrative guard like a Ja Morant or a Damian Lillard or a Darius Garland or a Jalen Brunson. But it worked last year in theory, or could have worked last year with Fred VanVleet. And Fred VanVleet is no one's definition of a 3-level scorer, in my opinion. Right? Ben Simmons was, I know it seems crazy now, but in his heyday, this is 2-3 years into his career, people said he was 1 jump shot away from being LeBron James, that it was that close. He was one of the best defenders in the NBA, if not the best defender in the NBA. I think he got robbed. Well, Ben Simmons was a really gifted athlete. He's a shifty athlete. His handle is super tight. He's got a really elite first step. He's even bigger than Scottie is. Russell Westbrook is an example of the same thing, right? There is a shiftiness in these guys. So then the question becomes, if you can't get to your spot by being shifty, athletic, and bursty, and you can't get to your spot by creating the gravity of pushing the defender up on you to push you off the line because you can shoot, then what options do you actually have to be an initiator? Well, a lot, actually. Magic Johnson was neither a bursty athlete, nor was he a he was a good ball handler. He wasn't Allen Iverson with the basketball. He was gifted. He was gifted as a playmaker, and that was a completely different era, and I understand that. But I do want to say that Andre Miller is probably a closer example to a player who has managed to sort of slow ball his game, and he was nowhere near as large an athlete as Scottie Barnes, but he would often post up all the way at the mid post. Sorry, at the midcourt, and he would sort of see over his defense. I mean, if you watched Andre Miller, if some of you are, I don't know, old enough to have remembered Andre Miller in his prime, he's a very effective and very interesting player, but he didn't really fit a mold, right? There are a lot of players like this, believe it or not. Luka Doncic is not bursty. He's not overly, he's shifty enough. He's creative enough. He has deception in his handle. His handle is further along than Scottie's by a mile. And I get that. But you have to understand that Scottie's a quicker athlete, a bigger athlete. He's much faster in transition. So if you're used to sort of seeing it go one way, I understand why it's almost impossible to understand how Scottie could be an initiator without either an unprecedented growth as a jump shooter or developing a way tighter handle and getting way quicker off the bounce. But I suggest a third way, which is I think he can just outthink his opponent. I think he can post up. I think he can post up as high as 20 feet. I think that mid-range turnaround came a long way. And I think once that post up starts going into 12 feet range, I think he attracts a double pretty quickly. The big playmaker advantage is viewing angles. Last year the Raptors had an undersized guard who would often get into the paint, and then he would see a swarm of arms, and then he would throw inaccurate, sometimes untimely, sometimes late, sometimes no pass, or take a terrible shot because he couldn't find an angle. Scottie not only tries creative things, he's also extremely accurate. Most of the lineups with him were not turnover prone. They were faster. He's faster. He just gets out in transition more. There's so much to be said about offensive rebounding. We talk about points per possession. We talk about the value of a possession. Getting an extra possession on an offensive rebound when the defense is scrambling and when the player getting it is one of 4 guys who are all really decent to good passers. You want to talk about things we haven't seen in the NBA. This is something you probably haven't seen in the NBA. 4 players who are expected to get the vast majority of offensive rebounds in this lineup are all really good passers. How quick is that read to OG in the opposite corner, or Gary spotting up, or Pascal streaking through? I think the passing for this lineup could be incredible. That negates, in my opinion, some of the spacing issues. I also want to say that I think the screen setting between OG, Pascal, not Pascal really, but Pascal is interesting. He could, if he wanted to. Jakob and Scottie could be very interesting, especially if they choose to use Gary in the way that I think they'll use Gary more, which is more as a movement shooter. So this offense can work, but one of the biggest advantages that I don't think people are giving it enough credit for is how good the passers are who are expected to get all those offensive rebounds, because this lineup killed it on the offensive glass, and they can kill it on the offensive glass. Whether they killed it or not in 129 possessions is irrelevant. In theory, this lineup should be beastly on the glass. So how effective and how accurate are those passes going to be? Also, probably helps that in theory, all 5 of these guys are much better paint scorers, so they can put back that shot at a higher rate than Fred VanVleet ever. The fourth thing is to stagger lineups. Now, it is not guaranteed that the lineup of Jakob Poeltl and Scottie Barnes, Gary Trent, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, that this lineup is going to be the most frequently used lineup. It stands to reason that typically your starters are your most frequently used lineup, but you have no idea how they plan to stagger this. You don't. You don't know if at every 4-minute mark in the first quarter, we're going to see Jakob Poeltl pulled out for, I don't know, a shooter like Grady Dick, and then OG slides to the 5, or Scottie slides to the 5, or Dennis Schroeder comes in or something, and then Scottie's more like a big in that lineup. You don't know that. You really don't know that. That lineup could run massive minutes. And then Otto could come in. Maybe Otto is the stretch 5 this year, and Precious is the 4, and Koloko is the free safety. You don't know that. What I'm saying is the expectation that this entire team is cursed because one 5-man lineup may or may not have had an effective run over 129 possessions last year is ludicrous. I would expect that you could stagger these lineups really well. What makes it helpful is all 3 of your non-shooters, in theory, are all good playmakers, and they do happen to be pretty versatile. I think Pascal could play anywhere from 1 to 5, and so could Scottie. I think Pascal can occasionally be your 1 in certain lineups. Maybe Dennis Schroeder plays a little off the ball. Could help him. He does some interesting things off the ball. He's smart. He cuts. Maybe Pascal can be your 5. Maybe Scottie can be your 1. Maybe Scottie can be your 5. There's a lot of different ways that you can use players like this. And it's not to be taken for granted. I understand that the Toronto Raptors have this sort of Vision 6'9" has become a running joke. But gosh, how many teams have 3 or 4 players on their roster who can justifiably play 4 positions? That's crazy. It's a very good amount of versatility, and in the right hands, it can be a strong benefit. So I do want to say that, you know, there is shooting on the bench. Getting Otto back, getting Dennis Schroeder, getting Grady Dick. I understand Dennis Schroeder is no one's idea of a lights out shooter, but he's a good shooter. He's okay. He is an above average, well, he's an average 3-point shooter. He's a slightly below average 3-point shooter. But Fred VanVleet was a below average 3-point shooter last year. Now I want you to look at the worst lineups in the NBA per the same metric that we are judging the Toronto Raptors. That one of those lineups includes Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Lou Dort, and Josh Giddey. Okay? And Pokashevsky and Jeremiah Robinson Earl. One of those lineups, probably surprising to no one, includes Killian Hayes and Jaden Ivey. Another one with Jaden Ivey and Sadiq Bey. But then the worst lineup is Chris Paul, like Mikal Bridges, DeAndre Ayton. Does that make sense to anybody? My point is, yeah, some of these lineups are going to be absolute shit. But in a small sample size, it isn't really easy to determine what type of lineup is going to typically be a very effective lineup or a 5-man unit in the NBA. But I can show you also that this holds true for also who is the best. Because if you look at the best lineups in the NBA, okay, you can argue that the top lineup, the Indiana Pacers lineup of Tyrese Halliburton, Miles Turner, and company, is a really good shooting lineup. But the second lineup there it includes Robert Williams, who is not a great 3-point shooter, and Derek White, who is not a great 3-point shooter, and Jaylen Brown, who's shaky, and Al Horford, who can shoot threes. But are you really comfortable saying Al Horford is a better 3-point shooter than Pascal Siakam on any given day? Because I'm not. Right? But what does that lineup have in spades? Defense. You have Jose Alvarado, Najee Marshall, Larry Nance. That's a top lineup, right? You have an Isaiah Hartenstein, Obi Toppin. I understand Obi can shoot a little bit, but come on, right? You have, there are some lineups here that don't shoot that well, right? And then you have the Toronto Raptors. But right below the Raptors, you have a lineup that also has 2 non-shooters. Christian Brown, kind of a non-shooter. Aaron Gordon, kind of a non-shooter. So, Jokic unlocks it. If you could find any value or any trend in this lineup, what would you say it would be? Be honest. What do you see here? Is there anything that you could realistically say these lineups are above average than an average NBA lineup that you see on a nightly basis? Well, with the exception of the New Orleans Pelicans lineup, I would say these lineups are unusually large. I'm just saying. It's pretty big. The De'Aaron Fox, Malik Monk, Kevin Huerter, okay, arguably that's not very large. But the vast majority of these lineups are significantly above average in terms of size. Now, the Raptors will be, in my estimation, the tallest team in the NBA if they start the 5 players that I think they're going to start. Okay. Now I want to address some stuff. Okay. Oh, shout outs if you got that reference. Look, we have been very critical. We, as in we, this channel, we, this community, for how people have talked about Fred VanVleet, and more specifically, how Fred VanVleet talked about Fred VanVleet this past season. And look, he got paid like he is, but the numbers do not lie, and his shot chart does not lie. He is not Damian Lillard. Don't get it twisted. Don't lie to yourself. All right? He's not. But the way people talk about this loss and the downgrade that is Dennis Schroeder, and I'm not denying that Dennis Schroeder is worse. Yeah, he's also making $27 million. Sorry, He's making $30 million less per year. Can we put that into context? $30 million less. So the reality is we want to think that Dennis Schroeder replaced Fred VanVleet. And we want to sort of subconsciously gap the difference between those two players. But that's not realistic, is it? That's not realistic at all, because Dennis Schroeder is not going to play 38 minutes or 37 minutes for this team. I'm very comfortable in saying that. Dennis Schroeder is certainly not going to have as many on-ball reps or shots as Fred VanVleet. So how are you doing a one-for-one conversion and saying, okay, well, because this guy's a little bit worse? And what is he worse at? Significantly worse. He's a better paint finisher by a bit. He's a better point of attack defender by a lot, actually. He is more versatile. He can switch up. He can actually block some shots for you. He's got a 6'7", 6'8" wingspan. So if he gets switched on to a small forward, you're not in scramble mode having to send a second defender. There are some actual benefits, you know? Like, I realize that we're all in very doom and gloom proposition right now of, oh my God, how can you replace this guy with this guy? But that's not actually what the Raptors did. The Raptors replaced Fred VanVleet with a hypothesis that Scottie and Pascal getting more on-ball reps. And Fred VanVleet, look, Fred VanVleet, like, this is, it's baffling to me. Fred VanVleet, the Fred VanVleet that started out last season, which is to say that 10 games where the Raptors were 500 before Pascal got hurt, okay? That Fred VanVleet. Now, you want to say 10 games is a small sample size? I call bullshit, and I tell you that 129 possessions is a small sample size. I'm going to use the first 10 games of last season as my sample size. I could make an argument that Fred VanVleet, during those first 10 games, was the 20th to 30th worst player in the NBA. He was awful. His defense was suffering. He was reportedly not 100%. His shot was not falling. He did not have as many on-ball reps at all. He was taking a very fourth option role on offense. And admittedly, he was struggling to find his offense. Still took a lot of boneheaded shots because he's not used to getting his game off on low volume. He honestly hurt the team more than he helped the team for the first 10 games. Fight me on it. I will fight you till I die. It's 100% fact. He was awful. For the first half of the season, he was honestly on track for one of the biggest year-to-year fall-offs in Raptor history. Okay? In a contract year. So you know it was killing him. As he openly wondered whether betting on himself had finally caught up with him. And as I openly joked that he would be playing in China next year, he did turn it around. But I want you to understand that before he turned it around, there was still a 20-game sample size where he was absolutely horseshit and significantly worse as a player than I expect Dennis Schroeder to be this year, where the Raptors were 500. Now, this is my big mic drop moment, because as someone who has a degree in statistics, nothing drives me more crazy and upsets me more than a bastardization and misuse of statistics. And I will tell you at the end of this live why I study statistics, because I think now that I've kind of gotten my groove going, I think I'm catching my wind in this live. So I apologize again for those first 6 minutes, which were hella awkward, but hopefully we're getting somewhere now. This is Damian Lillard's shot chart, okay? He is an elite paint finisher. He is an elite scorer. He is someone who commands and shifts the defense at will. Fred VanVleet is not that player. Regardless of how many times he drove into the paint and launched a layup at a 48% success rate, and the most efficient shot in basketball, which he somehow made inefficient. No matter how many times he did that, and that was a good year for him, by the way. He got better at it than he was, the previous year. I think it was 46%. So he got slightly better at it. But even slightly better was still way worse. So my question then to you is, how much worse? Like, let's assume, for just hypothesis, that 28% is not representative of the type of three-point shooter that Scottie is going to be. Okay, let me assume for a second that he's going to be at least 32%. Do you know that 32% on threes is the exact same thing as being 48% on twos under the basket? Same thing. So if Scottie can get himself to 32% on threes, his 3-point shot is going to generate you almost exactly as many points as a Fred VanVleet layup. Which begs the question, why am I even bringing up Fred VanVleet's layups? Isn't Fred VanVleet a 3-point shooter? Well, you see, the reason why big playmakers and 3-level scorers are so highly sought after in the draft is because they scramble defenses. They cause defenses to shift and they cause gaps to open up. And the theory is that as those gaps open up, that you can create openings for other players and that they make life easier for other players. This is what most great initiators do. This is what Kawhi Leonard can do. This is what Russell Westbrook in his prime could do. This is what Ja Morant, when he's right, can do. So what Fred VanVleet did was like a fraudulent version of that. Yeah, he took those shots, but it was irrational for him to take those shots. And granted, we can split the season and say, okay, the second half of the season was way better than the first half. And if he'd done the first half in the second half and the second half in the first half. But my point is that the Raptors were 500 regardless of what he did. Right? How much did he impact winning? Damian Lillard, when he goes out, there is like a sizable drop off. Like they were a playoff team when he was going right. He had a historic season. So I can understand that if the Portland Trailblazers lost Damian Lillard for nothing, that you could probably say they're going to be about 10 to 12 games worse. Easy. They're going to be 10 to 12 wins worse without him. But Fred VanVleet, bro, and this is the problem, because this media and this player specifically spent all year trying to gaslight this entire fan base into believing that he was this type of player, that he was, in fact, this level of player. What is the exact quote? I'm top 50 in my mind, and that number is way higher. Way higher than top 50 is top 20 to me. He thinks he's a top 20 player. He's not. He's not a top 30 player. He's not a top 40 player. I don't give a shit what the analytics say. So you're not replacing, number one, you're not replacing him with nothing. So you get that out of your head. Okay. Number two, there are other people and there are other benefits to having him not in the lineup. He was by no means a perfect player and by no means a great player. He was a good player. He contributed to winning. He had a disproportionate impact on how bad or how good the Raptors were on any given night. And that in itself was a problem, which we complained about all goddamn year. Now, if you believe the tom-toms and the conspiracy theories that he was at least one of the significant drivers of the team chemistry being as bad as it was, that his leadership created a black hole in this team, that him betting on himself, his late clock shot selection, his holding the ball, his inability to move off the ball, his defensive woes, which consistently gave up blow by after blow by, where he was completely helpless in terms of late contests and contesting from behind, even though he was a fairly decent, if not great, team defender within the scheme of the defense, which is designed by his best bud, Nick Nurse. What I'm saying is, I understand the numbers that tell you you're going to be 10 wins worse without Fred VanVleet. But I'm telling you also that as someone who watched this guy play, that you won't be. Now, let me just move on from this before I rant off on Fred VanVleet for like 6 hours. I mean, this is his shot chart, dude. Like, he's not great. Now, different strokes. I've kind of covered this already, right? These are two different players. They're very different players. They play a different style of basketball. But I can tell you one of them has as many deficits as the other, right? If you want to say Fred's a point guard and Scottie's a center or a big to you because that's just the way your brain is wired and that's how you see these guys, kudos to you. I'm not going to fight you any more than I already have. I get it. Point guards are small. Centers are muscular. One of these guys looks a certain way, plays a certain way. He dribbles high. He's not overly dynamic. I get it. I understand, man. I totally get it. But I'm telling you that there are different ways to play the point guard position. And this concept of point guards is so dated and so stupid in the modern NBA. Every player on the team who initiates is in some way a playmaker. And this notion of point guard, center, small forward, this is gone. I don't know a single person that I respect in the world of basketball that talks about these positions in the way that the Raptors media talks about these positions. It is an unevolved way of thinking. Thinking basketball had a pod where they openly questioned whether Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic were effectively point guards last year. And I tend to agree. The game is rapidly evolving. Big playmakers serve a huge advantage. I'll give you one clear advantage. I want you to imagine that somehow, by some divine miracle, Scottie Barnes actually beats his guy off the dribble. Like how he beat Alex Caruso off the dribble and dunked it on his head. Y'all remember that one? That big post dunk? Or like how he beat Ben Simmons off the dribble, or how he beat Giannis off the dribble. Let's assume that he can do that. Okay. Let's assume that Scottie Barnes has a sufficient handle to break his guy off the dribble. I don't care how he does it. Gets a screen, whatever. Okay. Here's what's going to happen to the defense. It's going to scramble because unlike with Fred VanVleet, there's actually a threat that he's going to score at a really efficient rate. Now, 56%, 57% was a little low for him last year. I expect that number to be consistently above 62 if he's healthy. He has all the makings of an elite paint finisher. He's long, he's crafty, he has good hand-eye coordination. There's nothing other than reps and concentration and health that should have him being anything lower than 60%. So 56, 57% is inexcusable. Okay. Point is, even if you don't know the percentages off by heart, this is not a player that defenses will ignore going to the basket. They will always try to collapse. Here's what happens when you collapse on Fred VanVleet. He collapses. If he doesn't time it exactly, he's going to get blocked, or he's going to get swiped, or the pass is going to get picked off, or that angle is going to close off, because the nature here of physics is simple. Bigger playmakers have bigger viewing angles. It's just fucking physics. I swear to God, it's the simplest thing to explain. I could explain it to a toddler, that if you can pass from the angle that Scottie can pass from and see from the angle that he can see from, then there is a very solid chance that you're going to be very unbothered by even really long wings, because he's patient and he sees the game really well. I don't care what people say. There's one thing that his haters and his lovers and his biggest fans all agree on, which is that he processes the game at an unreal speed for a player his age. So if he does manage to somehow get into the paint, I just want to throw this out there. Do y'all remember them playing? Fred VanVleet couldn't beat freaking Nikola Vucevic off the dribble, who's one of the worst defenders in the NBA. Like, there's so many examples of this. As a person who studied the film, I am absolutely annoyed at how people talk about this subject. Anyways, my point is, if you have a player this size who gets downhill and actually gets past his man, this will force shifts in the defense, because he is also a really good, quick, timely, accurate, and very creative passer. So, like we talk about deception. Does he deceive with his dribble? No, he deceives with his passing. He doesn't deceive with his dribble very much yet, but he deceives with his passing. And that means that the thing that Kawhi Leonard can do for Kawhi, Scottie Barnes can do for somebody else. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So I'm saying that I think Scottie can be a better point guard than Fred VanVleet. That's what I'm saying. Jeez. Now, we're just going to let this play out as I wax poetic on how good I think Scottie Barnes is. I was supposed to let this play out, but look, man, there's a lot of things that he showed last year that people just ignore, because when you look at the broad-based numbers, You see, okay, well, NBA University just released this thing where he was like bottom 10 in the league and pull-up jumpers, and his percentage on this type of shot is bad and that type of shot is bad and mid-range is bad. But it's like, yo, like, this is a 21-year-old player. You're not judging the trajectory based on a 1-year shift. I'm judging the full trajectory. I'm looking at 5 years, and where he was 5 years ago and where he is today. The trajectory is very promising. The stuff that he's doing right now, like right here, this dribble, when someone says that he did not show any improvement last year, that's cap, bro. I don't care if you watched every possession. I don't care if you watched every possession 4 times. The problem with you watching every possession 4 times is you're the one watching. We will get into biases right after this. But I think that it's absurd to someone who would track his possessions and see how he is scoring to not see that there was a difference not only in how teams guarded him last year relative to the year before, but also in the types of things that he was daring to try. A lot of his stuff, like this pull-up jumper, like where was that in his rookie year? Where were the 5-3 games in his rookie year? Where was a 7 or 8 attempts from 3 game? Like where was this massive fourth quarter, scoring surges, getting past Kevin Durant, Yuta Watanabe, and Ben Simmons? These are all above league average defenders, by the way. Everyone I just mentioned was a league average to above league average defender. He was not beating scrubs. Alex Caruso, by some people's estimate, is the best defender in the NBA, or at least the second best defender in the NBA. He beat him off the dribble clear. He made him look like a little bitch. Like, yo. Like, y'all talking about him like he's freaking Dwight Howard or something. It's a little absurd to me. So I'm bringing it back to what's your bias, right? Because we have biases. We all do. Okay. And we're going to talk about a few biases. Let me flash a couple of biases for you. Okay. This is going to be, let's call it the educational component of this, this live. Here are some biases. Here are some cognitive biases for you. Okay. Anchoring effect, right? Relying too much on the initial piece of information offered when making decisions. I think the anchoring bias or anchoring effect is very strong when it comes to the NBA. Honestly, we have this idea that Monty Bates has some incredible potential, and he may. But we also have this belief that someone like Fred VanVleet would be a bum, and he wasn't. So what is it? It is that first impression. The availability heuristic, overestimating the importance and likelihood of events given the greater availability of information. Bandwagon effect, right? How many of us are looking to other people to figure out what we think? There's a consensus. There's a social component to life and sports. Belief bias, basing the strength of an argument on the believability or plausibility of the conclusion. This is a logical fallacy. Blind spot bias, viewing oneself as less biased than others. Oh, this took a while. Clustering illusion, erroneously overestimating the importance of small clusters or patterns in large data. Confirmation bias, focusing on information that only confirms your pre-existing preconceptions. Courtesy bias, giving an opinion conclusion that is viewed as more socially acceptable so as to avoid causing offense or controversy. Oh man, I feel like I'm describing someone, right? Endowment effect, the tendency of people to ascribe more value to things merely because they already own/have them. This could also be something what Gaudiology talked about, which is the IKEA effect. This sense of I put labor in it, therefore it's more important. Gambler's fallacy, believing that future probabilities are altered by past events when in fact they are unchanged and unrelated. Hyperbolic discounting, preferring a smaller, sooner payoff over a larger, later reward. Illusion of validity, overestimating our ability to make accurate predictions, especially when data appears to tell us a different story. Ostrich effect, avoiding negative financial information by pretending it doesn't exist. And in this case, This wouldn't be financial, but it would be effectively basketball related. So, for instance, someone who would look at that Jakob Poeltl 5-man lineup with the other 4 starters might have an ostrich effect to the Christian Koloko variant of that and suggest to themselves, hey, if Jakob Poeltl is in theory better than Christian Koloko, then is it possible that with a larger data sample size that this lineup of 5 players could actually be one of the best lineups in the NBA? Post-purchase realization, the tendency to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to an opinion one has selected. Reactive devaluation, devaluing an idea because it originated from an adversary or opponent. Risk compensation, taking bigger risks when perceived safety increases, being more careful when perceived risk increases. And status quo biases, preferring the current state of affairs over change. And then, of course, stereotyping, assuming a person has characteristics because they are a member of a group. I think every single one of these, without much of a stretch of logic, is absolutely there with Scottie. Okay. He looks a certain way. He plays a certain way. You don't have a tangible player to compare him to. He is very original. Is he Draymond? Is he Giannis? He's not big enough to be Giannis. He's not slow enough to be Draymond. He's not apparently skilled enough to be Kawhi, even though I think his skills are ahead of Kawhi's at the same age. So what is he? The Black Swan effect. You know, I think this is where I can start talking. I mean, and shout outs to Nassim Taleb. I think Nassim Taleb, sorry. A friend of mine is a really big fan of his and has met him and has gone to his conferences. And the Black Swan effect is interesting. The Black Swan theory. Obviously, swans are white. So the notion of a black swan is supposed to be something that is unpredictable, extreme, unprecedented, and has to be considered the rarest of rare events. I think there are a lot of things that could be considered, let's call it black swan-ish, right? Luka Doncic and Nikola Jokic being the two of the 5 best players in the NBA, based on the idea of what you think a basketball player should look like, act like, talk like, be from, right? When I think basketball, like I'm a kid who grew up, yes, I am originally from the same country that produced those 2 players. So I have a different set of experiences and expectations. But as a New York kid, I grew up around a lot of people who expected basketball players to come from New York. Fred VanVleet's talked about it too. Basketball players don't come from Rockford. Scottie Barnes has talked about it. Well, sort of in passing. Basketball players don't come from West Palm Beach, right? So there is this understanding that greatness is a deviation from expectations. And if you had met Fred VanVleet at 13, could you have charted who he would be? If you'd met him at 22, could you? If you'd met him at 25, could you see who he'd be at 29? I don't think you could have. He did. He saw it. He thought it out. He played it out. Damian Lillard, Weber State, John Morant. You know, these 2 guys have one thing in common. They were not highly touted high school players at all. Who saw that coming? 2 of the best point guards in the NBA. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was not a super highly touted prospect. Who saw him becoming a top 6 player in the NBA? Every one of these players. Donovan Mitchell. Why did he go to 13th? Why did Dwayne Wade go to 5th? Why was Dwayne Wade, yes, that Dwayne Wade, so clearly Hall of Famer Dwayne Wade, going to be inducted in the Hall of Fame? Do you know that prior to the week of the 2023 draft, I read a very credible mock draft which had him going 21st? Dwayne Wade, bro. Dwayne Wade. Do you know prior to him pulling out of that draft, that Pavel Podkolzin, who eventually ended up being absolutely nothing, was supposed to go ahead of Chris Bosh? Yo, man, I'm telling you, people get things wrong all the time, myself included, and a lot of smart people included. We need to be humble in our approach here. And we need to understand that sometimes it takes one to know one. And the vast majority of people who talk about great people aren't great. They lack greatness. Now, I've always believed, to some extent, that you needed to know so much about everything to talk about anything with any weight or value. Even in this, let's say 55-minute talk, I have touched on so many things from statistics to basketball to, I mean, how many different topics, how many different subtopics have I jumped across? I've gone to psychology, cognitive biases, and there's so much more. We could talk about physics, math. We could talk about politics. Of course, there are politics at play when it comes to Fred VanVleet, the conversation around Fred VanVleet and this Raptors media. Of course, there's politics and, there's psychological things at play here in terms of how we perceive certain events happening. So the question then becomes, it's like, how do you know? How do we, as analysts or anybody who speaks about basketball, speak with any amount of credibility or sureness? How do we say, when I know that guy's going to be great? How do you know? How do you know that guy's going to be great, not going to be great? How do you know? For instance, the Raptors just signed Javon Freeman Liberty. Congratulations. I love this pickup for the Toronto Raptors. Watched them play a little bit in the Summer League. Thoroughly impressed. Bucket getter. Saw him play a game last night. Went back and watched it against St. John's. Put up 40 points. That's awesome, man. Like, he could score. He's a bucket. Who saw this coming from him? The Athletic had an article out. They said among all the players who were not like lottery picks or whatever, he is the one player who made the largest case for himself as an NBA guy. He went undrafted 2 years ago. How did he go undrafted? How did Fred VanVleet go undrafted? How did Ben Wallace go undrafted? How did all of these people go undrafted? If people that are supposedly in charge are experts, how does anyone make mistakes this large? How does someone pick Marvin Bagley over Luka Doncic? How does someone pick Jalen Green or Cade Cunningham, frankly, over Evan Mobley and Scottie Barnes? I'm sorry. There's so many mistakes that are made every single year that this idea that we can have these stupid takes, we can forget about them a year later, and we can pretend we play the whole horse and pony show all over again, and we pretend the whole thing didn't happen, and now we're experts. Yo, man, own your fucking losses. The same people who want to tell you Scottie is a center, he's not a point guard, he's not going to be successful, not going to grow, he's going to have trouble scoring, he's going to lead like one of the worst offenses. These are the same people who told you Jalen Suggs was a better prospect. I promise you, go back and listen to their takes. Just go back. These people forget what they say. I don't forget what they say. I write things down. I have the memory of an elephant, for better or for worse. Which means that every single day I wake up and wonder how I got Walker Kessler wrong. I wonder what it was in his tape that I didn't see. I want to understand this. It's never going to be perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. But I have to keep stabbing at it with the expectation that at some point, whatever process I'm trying to create here is going to get a little bit more accurate. I want to talk about why I believe in Scottie. And I'll bring it back to something a little personal for me. I studied two things in university. It's not what I wanted to study initially. Prior to my mom passing away, my mom passed away when I was in first year university. I genuinely wanted to study criminology, and I wanted to become a lawyer. That was my entire pathline. That's what I wanted to do. And that was a timely thing. You have to go to law school, and it was a whole thing. And then when my mom passed away, I didn't have family, I had to think about money, I had to think about earning. I shifted my focus entirely to something else. But I tell you, how I chose my major was really weird. When I was in high school, a guidance counselor told me that I could do anything I wanted to as long as it did not include writing, because I was an atrocious writer. All of my marks said that I was a bad writer. And this was a grade 11 guidance counselor. Politics, history, my marks were really bad. Math, calculus, physics, marks were great. So the evidence is right there on the paper, right? It's the paper telling you that. I flashed back prior to that, and I read a statistic saying that people who come from broken homes are more likely to be this and that. They're supposed to be failures. I read that if you grew up poor, you're more likely to be poor. I've read that if you've experienced a great deal of trauma and abuse in your life, that you will inherently grow up with a slew of psychological issues, that you will find it very hard to be a normal adult, that you will likely pass on such trauma things to your kids. I've read the stats, bro. One of the biggest reasons I took philosophy was because my guidance counselor told me not to take it. And I needed to know if I could do the thing that I was being told I couldn't do. The reason I studied stats is because I needed to understand how the people who get paid millions of dollars to create projections got me so wrong. Because I am not what I'm supposed to be. Every single day when you grow up in government housing, bouncing around shelters, bouncing around foster care, you hear what the world thinks you're supposed to end up being. You are statistically more likely to end up in jail than end up in university with my background. When you add in a dead parent and another dead parent prior to the age of 20, odds mean nothing to me. Nothing. So when I look at Scottie Barnes, or a lot of other players too, I tell you, I'm not looking for the same thing that a lot of people are. I'm not looking for the same things, man. I'm looking for how he processes emotions. I'm looking for his goals, because I'm telling you that regardless of how well Cade Cunningham handles the ball right now, that what drives him and what drives Scottie are different things. Their focus, their habits, their mindset. So when I see a player like Scottie Barnes in his rookie year show up against LeBron James, show up against Luka Doncic, show up against Jason Tatum, scream at Kevin Durant as he rips away the ball, I say to myself, where have I seen this before? Where have I seen that before? Well, I saw it in Michael Jordan. I saw it in Kobe Bryant. I saw that in Magic Johnson. I saw it in Larry Bird. I saw an ability to see what you could be beyond what you are. And it is unflinching. It is ridiculous commitment to that vision. And you know what? There's hundreds of examples in NBA history of players who achieved something that would be considered probably in the realm of impossible when they were drafted. Consider Jimmy Butler, 30th pick, older rookie. Did anyone expect him to be one of the greatest playoff scorers of all time? No. Kyle Lowry. Did you ever expect when Brian Colangelo traded a first-round pick for him, that he was trading a first-round pick for the greatest Raptor of all time, a franchise that included Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, Chris Bosh, DeMar DeRozan, and eventually Kawhi Leonard? Did you expect that little chubby 6'1" guy to be the greatest Raptor of all time? No, you did not. When I talk about greatness and what defines greatness, it is not something that I can put into numbers. I tell you it will eventually translate to numbers, sure. But the mindset, and one of my biggest talking points on this channel is when people show you who they are, believe them. Man, when Kawhi Leonard's father passed away, when Mark Leonard died, he still played the fucking game. That is not normal. If I could tell you if there's 100 indicators of the type of player that Kawhi would be, none of them include how great his handle was at San Diego State. None of them. There are so many physical advantages, mental advantages, psychological advantages, emotional advantages, intangible advantages that Scottie Barnes has, that someone who does not understand life beyond paper will never understand. But man, the people who talk about this dude, from YouTubers and armchair analyst coaches, these people, they do not see the greatness in this player the way a Kevin Garnett did, the way a Kevin Durant did, a Jason Kidd did, a Magic Johnson did, a Kyle Lowry did. They don't see it. Why? Because those people do what Scottie does. Every player I just described is a really smart player. Every one of them. Every one of them had to learn the things that Scottie's doing now. And they're impressed because he's doing them at an earlier age than all of those guys did. Except for a couple of them. Granted, Magic, Jason Kidd, very gifted passers. But I'm saying it takes one to know one sometimes. And I understand that there is an element of hubris when we get a little stamped, or we get a little clout, or we start getting a lot of views, or we get a lot of viewers, or we get a lot of subscribers, to suddenly start thinking that we know something more. But I tell you, I've listened to Darko Rakovic talk, and I've listened to Scottie Barnes talk. I could work a very, very long time and study every basketball book on the planet. And provided that those two are still alive and still interested in basketball, I will never know as much about basketball as those two people know. Because there are levels to this, as is a famous saying. There are levels to this. There are. So, to the Toronto Raptor fan, to the Raptor faithful, here's my parting message to you. And this goes to my best and worst case projections. Best case projection. I see a playoff team. Okay. I see some unprecedented, but in my opinion, precedented growth from Scottie Barnes, which is expected. By the way, shout out to Scottie's mom, Kat. It's her birthday today for another 2 hours. So happy birthday. Very, very special person. I see, a playoff team, man. I do. The East has weakened. Hardly anyone's talking about that, right? This team will have a training camp under a very good coach. In my opinion, a very good coach who has been coaching for a very long time, even though he's not coaching in the NBA, who's had success playing lineups, which include a lot of non-shooters. I mean, shit, man. Memphis Grizzlies, Dylan Brooks, Steven Adams. Like, he knows how to do this. Okay? Yeah, there's no John Morant and there's no Desmond Bane here, but come on now. Okay? It's not chopped liver. OG and Gary are not chopped liver. Pascal is not chopped liver. Scottie's not chopped liver. All right? There is some realistic optimism for a 45 to 50 win season. Okay? If Pascal stays. If Pascal doesn't stay, okay, maybe we're firmly in play-in territory. But even then, I don't think the wheels fall off. Downside? Honestly, the way this team crashes the glass, the way they defend, and as connected as I expect them to be, I think the downside, if this team stays as is about 38 wins. Okay. So 38 wins to 50 wins is my upside downside on the Raptors. In terms of where their half-court offenses will be, I don't know, man. I think there's a chance they could sneak into top 20. I don't think they'll sneak into top 15. But in terms of defense, this is a team that can be as good as it wants to be. There are no real weak holes on defense. Yes, point of attack defense will be a little tough without the right schemes, because you don't have a solid point of attack defender without, well, you didn't have one last year either, but maybe you do start Dennis Schroeder, or you play Dennis Schroeder more minutes so that you balance it out. But that starting lineup may struggle. Scottie's going to have to get a lot more flexible. With those high hips, it's hard to get around screens. But I just want to say that there's no reason for doom and gloom. There are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and then there are unknown unknowns. And I think there's so many things about the Raptors offense that it would be impossible, even for someone who tracked a lot of what Darko has done and said over the last 15 years and has a pretty good understanding through the grapevine of the things that he wants to do with this offense beyond what he has committed to record. He will tell you that until you get into training camp, until you see how ready Grady Dick is, until you see what all of this offseason work that Gary is putting in is actually going to result in, until you see if Precious can get himself back on track, until you see what Christian Koloko can contribute, if anything, until you see how healthy Otto is. There's so many freaking variables on this team that for me to sit here and say, no, they will be bad, or no, they will be good, it's ludicrous. So that's why I'm going for a 12-win swing on my upside downside. Thank you. There's a super chat. That's a really big super chat. Thank you so much, Leanne. I really appreciate it. Thank you. did have a brain surgery. How do you know about that? Have I talked about that? He is. But trust me, so is Scottie, man. So is Scottie. Thoughtful Live, Rob. What would you guess the percentage chance of prime Grady Dick landing in each of the following groups? Superstar, star, starter, rotation, or bust? Okay, that's a really good question. Superstar, 5%. Star, 15%. Starter, 50%. Rotation, 20%. Bust, 10%. I hope that I mapped out the full 100. I hope you get the sentiment. As I mentioned, I'm very tired and very sleepy right now, so I hope that that added up to 100. But yeah, I'm not seeing a ton of superstar stuff here with him, but like I definitely don't see a bust, right? He does a lot of really great things. He's a 90 Larry Bird percentile. He is not, but sure. He might. Look, I left the 5% because honestly, I think at this age, adding more than 5% to superstar to anyone other than Scoot, Wemby, and maybe someone like Bilal Coulibaly, who just has physical gifts galore. But again, look, Luka Doncic and Paul Pierce and Nikola Jokic have taught us that physical gifts are not everything. And I think the way that we test athleticism needs to change. I talked about it in the video on neuroscience with Catherine. There's so many things we don't test for very well. We don't test for balance. We don't test for problem solving, visual acuity. There's so many things, hand-eye coordination. There's so many things that go into how a player functions on the basketball court that I think it would be silly to say that Bilal Coulibaly has some exponentially higher chance of being a superstar than Grady Dick. What would stop Grady Dick from being a superstar? Honestly, if his shot never comes around to like 41 to 42% from three on high volume, I just don't see how he makes up for that. Burst this kind of shaky physical advantages. I think he needs to develop a lot physically, but man, I loved some of the stuff that he does. Like off ball cutting. He's so smart for his age. Like he's such a good basketball player, man. Like a really good basketball player. I am very impressed with what I saw from him in Summer League. And trust me, I don't care about the stats that he put up in Summer League. This is not relevant to me, whether he scored, how he scored. I'm talking about how he operates, like how he thinks the game. These are all very impressive things that, in my opinion, they do translate forward very well. I know a lot of people, I have known a lot of people in my life who really understood the game of basketball. I mean, they're not anything close to analysts. They don't work for the NBA. They don't work within the NBA. They're just people who studied the game, followed the game, played in high school, played maybe like in a low-level pro club in Serbia for a couple of years, fizzled out, realized they didn't have it, maybe did a year in Turkey and called it quits. Like these people they don't have clout, they don't have anything, but man, they understand basketball so well. You start talking to these people and you realize how quickly, I was listening to Will Lou's pod and he talked about how when he went down to Summer League, he realized how incredibly aware the fans in Summer League are. And yeah, if you've been down to Summer League, that's a place for diehards. Those people know all the plays. They know the plays that you're running on the court. They know where this player played. They know everything about everything when it comes to basketball. There's so many junkies, basketball junkies, hoop heads, people who consume content at an absurd, passionate rate. And these people are not analysts. And I assure you that there's some Joe Schmo walking the streets of Atlanta or Oklahoma or Detroit or Toronto or Vancouver and he just watches the game, and he has maybe some passing knowledge of hockey and soccer that he's used to understand basketball. And that person could probably talk circles around 95% of the people who are paid to talk about basketball. So I don't like necessarily this idea of, well, I talk about basketball for a living, so I'm better than so and so or so and so. You're not. I've always wanted this channel to be about growing ideas and growing thinkers. Sorry, more about growing thinkers than growing ideas. And so I would like to empower everybody here to do their research. Some of these websites are subscription based, but they're $5 a month. If you love basketball, you could easily push $5 a month, towards cleaning the glass, and look up these numbers for yourself, right? Analytics are fascinating. There's a lot of sites that are free. NBA.com does a great job of sorting analytics. It's not very complicated at all. And what behooves me and somewhat annoys me is the people who get even one step ahead of their audience start talking like they start talking down to their audience. And that's very annoying to me. I have been probably rambling for about 15 minutes now as these super chat stickers come in. And I'm realizing the more I ramble, the more these super chat stickers come in. So maybe I'm just doing this for money at this point. But I want to thank you all for joining me. And thank you for putting up with me, as I'm probably not making a lot of sense right now. And I'm very tired. I approached this live. I told someone that I was going to approach this live like Denzel from Training Day. And I actually came at it more like Elf from Elf, But I was very upset. To those of you who follow Raptors well, you know why I'm upset. I was upset because I was listening to people that I really respect ignoring some very big things and presenting their opinion as fact. And that was annoying to me. So I wanted to create this live as hopefully a counterbalance to the pessimism. And how funny is it when everyone was saying it was okay, this channel was saying the sky is falling. And now when everyone says the sky is falling, this channel is saying, y'all chill, it's going to be okay. Will lightning strike twice? I have no idea. But yeah, Reddit is the worst. This we can agree on. Anyway, y'all, take care. Have a great night. Have a good weekend. Stay blessed. And I don't think I've ever said stay blessed on this live ever before, but I'm saying it. Peace, guys. Have a good one. And thank you, everyone, for the super chats. Very, very nice of you. Thank you.